Hello and welcome to poetry, and this time we're going to be looking at emotional and sensory language. So the kinds of language which basically brings the poem to life a little bit, and also the kinds of language which you'd be probably fairly familiar with when you're looking at narratives or novels, which is the kinds of things which sort of connect with an audience, particularly with people's empathy for emotional or a sense. And it's a primary way that a lot of poems communicate because of the fact that they are a form of self-expression. However, poetry probably relies on this self-expression a little bit more than what prose normally does. So prose usually will provide a little bit of description which will go and connect with emotional and sensory language. So they won't bombard the reader with emotional sensory language because it can be a bit of a heavy thing to read. However, a poem doesn't really have to worry about that because it's only that long. So what it does is it will use poetry and emotional and sensory language a lot more. It will use a lot more expression, emotional expression. So it is a form which is quite natural to a poem. And the reason it is quite natural to a poem is not only because it is a self-expressive medium, but because of the fact that it is so short that emotional and sensory kinds of words are able to describe things with a lot more detail and a lot more vividness than what you would if you're just writing a normal prose sentence. So they are quite simple in that way, and also there are very simple frameworks that you can refer to. So obviously when you've looked at things like happiness and sadness and all those things, but also other kinds of emotions, anger, emotion, grief, loss, these sorts of things come across in poems quite a lot, and are written in such a way where they're very easy to pick up. So when you have a look at it and you're looking for some things that you can talk about, then immediately you will go straight for what sort of emotions are expressed in this poem and what sort of sensory language is being used. So let's start with emotional language. Now, as I said, as poems often express emotion, it's a fairly simple technique to interpret. However, it is not necessarily just happy or sad. So it's not something which is necessarily directly stated, and nor will it necessarily say a particular emotional keyword. So let me give you an example. A poem may, for instance, say a cold wind blows instead of I feel lonely. So the way that you interpret that line is purely an emotional response. Now you might be thinking, well, isn't that a sensory response as well? Yes, it is. But when you're looking at it in terms of the emotional angle, you can look at it in a sense that when you're using a cold wind, you sort of think of someone who's alone and sitting there with no one else around them and feeling the wind against them. And that sort of image, when it appears in your head, you sort of imagine something like loneliness or isolation. Of course, you can discuss this in many different ways, and it's up to your interpretation and also the context of the poem, which is also quite important. So while you may not necessarily even understand the whole thing at times, one of the things you can do is, as you go through and as you've got some key points of ideas or techniques that the poem uses, you can go back to particular lines, particularly the emotional sorts of lines, and then throw your own interpretation on them and say that that particular line or that particular way of speaking is a way that the poem expresses that particular emotion. So when you have a look at it, you basically can add this whole emotional depth and particularly discussion in your argument. Now, emotion often creates mood and atmosphere in your poem as well, or when you're reading it. So it helps add to your layers of techniques. It's something that as well, it's also up to your interpretation. So, as I said, a cold wind blows could be loneliness, but it could also be sadness, fear, hostility, depending on how it's written and also depending on how you interpret it. So, a cold wind blows could even just be a cold wind blowing. It's not necessarily important that you go through and you analyze every single line specifically, but if you do find a line there which stands out to you as meaning something, or at least meaning something to you when you read it, talk about it. Discuss it. Why does it make you feel that way? If you read something and it makes you feel a particular way, why wouldn't you discuss it? And why wouldn't you discuss it in the context of how it makes you feel? Because if you provide evidence for that, and you provide a discussion, really half your answer is done. So you're able to connect immediately this idea or this bit of language in a poem to whatever you think it means. So you must think about the effect that that sort of statement is making, how the idea will connect to a particular meaning. And you must also support it with two things, which some of them I've mentioned before. First, which is the context. So the lines or stanzas before or after is written. Now you don't have to necessarily include them, but you have to pay very close attention to them to make sure that the line you're talking about makes sense. So if, as I mentioned before, if it's a poem about sadness, and then you've got a line there that is happy, or you interpret that line as being happy, and yet it stands out as being slightly odd, then maybe go back over the context to see if that's really what you could argue it as meaning. So if you have something that doesn't make sense at all, and you try and back it up, it's very, very hard to do. Whereas if you've got something which actually does make sense, it's probably a better way to go. But also you need to have a discussion which connects that idea to what you defined as your meaning. Now, when you come across a line, for instance, a tear rolled down her cheek, that might immediately go, well, that's sadness, it's obvious it's sadness. Well, it could be and it could not be. Yes, obviously, when people cry, often it's because of sadness. But what if that was because they received an engagement ring or something along those lines? That wouldn't be sadness, that would be happiness. So you need to connect that particular image to its meaning. So if you're using that line and saying what's sadness because they're crying, well, it might not be. It could be cries of anger, it could be cries of joy, it could be cries of excitement even. It could be that they were just peeling some onions at the time. It doesn't really give you a lot unless you give some sort of backing and description which goes with it. So it is something that you have to be rather careful of. All right, let's go on to sensory language, because obviously immediately going, okay, well, it's about the five senses, but it's not really, because we're mainly counting four. Obviously, when you look at imagery, you're covering sight. So you'd be mainly looking at things like sound, smell, taste, and touch. And a lot of authors use images a lot anyway, because obviously the eyes are a gateway to us looking at the world and being able to describe the world. Whereas sound, smell, and taste and touch aren't really as natural gateways for us to interpret the world, unless it's dark and we've got no other senses. So like you're walking around in the middle of the night and suddenly you start feeling things, you start smelling things, you start listening for different noises. Those are the only times really those senses come into play. Usually you would rely on your eyesight. So it's very similar to how you're looking at a poem. And if there is a particular sensory word which sticks out, then you would use it. So yes, there are similarities between emotion and senses. And they can be discussed in fairly similar ways. So the way that you need to look at discussing it is to do so in a way where you can actually talk about how emotion and senses are linked. So for instance, the taste of blood burned through his lips could easily suggest anger as well as a particular taste. So you could use senses to describe an emotion, which is anger. And in this particular case, you can. So like the image of the boxer to the right, if they are tasting blood, it could be something to inspire anger in them and maybe get them to have a miraculous comeback in the fight. But really, when you have a look at this line, you can interpret it not just through the literal, okay, well, there's just blood in his lips, so he's maybe been punched or something. That is one way of describing it, but you can go a lot deeper in saying that it's also an emotional statement as well as a sensory one, and you can actually develop and broaden your discussion based on that idea, that it's two different language techniques in one. Now, language techniques aren't isolated. They can be things which are linked to each other, or particular key words, particularly language technique words, can be used to describe the same thing and do so in a number of different ways. So using evidence, you can actually discuss this statement as both a sensory and emotional language device. And it's one which is very powerful in the sense that you tend to feel for that person. You tend to feel that sensation of having blood in your lips and tasting blood and all the rest, and that sort of symbol that tasting blood means anger and all the rest. So you can actually discuss it in a number of different ways as well. So what you've got to do then is you've got to find an effect out of sensory language and find out what the meaning or the effect of it is. So often poets will use it to add extra life to their piece. And in poetry, senses are often used in the place of description. So normally you would describe maybe a roadway as being tarmac, stones, gravel, whatever they are. A poet may describe them as being a particular sound. So the sound of screeching brakes, for instance. And that gives a whole heap of extra depth, because not only are you describing a road, you're describing the cars, the things that go on it as well. And you're leaving it far more open to interpretation, which ultimately is not necessarily what poetry is meant to do. But often very good poetry has things which can be interpreted in a number of different ways. And particularly the way that language is set up creates something that's very personal to those who read it. If someone reads poetry and immediately imagines the scene in their own environment, in their own context, then quite literally what's happening is that they have taken a personal connection to that poem. And that's often what poets are trying to do. However, that's not necessarily to say that all poetry you read is going to do that, and nor is that necessarily the poet's intent. So have a look at those sorts of sensory descriptions, and have a look if something is based on a feel rather than just a particular kind of description. So that's basically it, really. When you're looking at emotions and senses, what you're trying to do is find some terms that immediately stand out and talk about them in such a way where after you read the poem, you are feeling a particular way. So if you felt sad after reading a particular poem, go back to the part that made you sad. See what language is used. See why it makes you feel that way. Or if it's something that makes you sort of feel like the poem's come to life and you sort of imagine in a number of different ways, again, go back and see what it was that made you do that, because often you'll find that it was an emotional or a sensory language device that did that. Otherwise, there's not much else to really tell about that. So until I next see you, I'll see you later.